The autumn of 1889 had settled upon London with that peculiar melancholy which transforms the familiar thoroughfares of the metropolis into mysterious corridors of shadow and gaslight. It was on such an evening, the 28th of October, that I found myself seated in our comfortable quarters at 221B Baker Street, attempting to focus my attention upon a medical treatise while my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, occupied himself with what appeared to be a particularly vexing chemical analysis. The acrid scent of his latest experiment had driven me to crack open the window slightly, despite the chill that crept in with the evening fog. Holmes stood before his makeshift laboratory bench, his long, sinewy fingers manipulating glass apparatus with the precision of a master craftsman, his aquiline features illuminated by the flickering flame of his Bunsen burner. He had been in one of his restless moods for the better part of a week, alternating between periods of feverish intellectual activity and stretches of profound ennui that I'd come to recognize as the symptoms of a mind starved for stimulation. "You have been to Stamford's club this afternoon, Watson," Holmes remarked without turning from his work, his voice carrying that tone of casual certainty that had long ceased to surprise me, though it never failed to intrigue. I set down my journal with a rueful smile. "Indeed I have, Holmes, though I confess I cannot fathom how you deduce it. I mentioned nothing of my plans this morning, and I took care to change completely before returning." "Elementary, my dear fellow." He turned from his apparatus, fixing me with those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to read the very soul of a man. "You are sitting precisely 2 inches further from the fire than is your custom, suggesting recent exposure to considerable warmth. The faint aroma of that particular Turkish tobacco favoured by the club clings to your waistcoat, a blend not available in ordinary establishments. Furthermore, there is a small circular impression on your left wrist, consistent with the brass tokens they provide for the billiard room. You attempted to rub it away, but the mark remains visible to the trained observer." Before I could respond to this typical display of observation, our conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried yet hesitant footsteps upon the stairs. The tread spoke of urgency, tempered by uncertainty. Someone driven by desperation yet unsure of their welcome. "A client approaches, Watson," Holmes murmured, his entire demeanor transforming in an instant. The languid scientist vanished, replaced by the alert and eager investigator, and one in considerable distress, if the irregular rhythm of his step is any indication. Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door, her kindly face bearing an expression of concern. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson? Forgive the intrusion, but there is a gentleman below who insists upon seeing you immediately. He appears most agitated and claims the matter cannot wait until morning." "Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson." Holmes moved swiftly to clear his chemical apparatus from the table. "Watson, would you be so kind as to stoke the fire? Our visitor will require warmth, and I suspect he has had quite enough of the evening air." Within moments, a gentleman of middle years entered our sitting room, and I was immediately struck by the contradiction he presented. His attire spoke of comfortable circumstances, a well-tailored overcoat of fine wool, expertly crafted boots, and a gold watch chain that glinted in the firelight. Yet his face was drawn with anxiety, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth, and his hands trembled as he removed his hat. The pallor of his complexion and the haunted quality of his gaze spoke of a man who had not known peaceful sleep for many nights. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice hoarse with emotion and fatigue. "I am he, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson, who has been good enough to chronicle some of my more interesting cases." Holmes gestured toward the chair nearest the fire. "Please, be seated. You appear thoroughly chilled, and I observe that you have traveled some distance this evening. From the West Country, if I am not mistaken." The gentleman sank into the offered chair with evident relief, accepting the glass of brandy I provided with a grateful nod. "You are quite correct, sir. I've come up from Somerset on the afternoon train. My name is Henry Willoughby, and I fear that I come to you with a matter which may prove either the gravest catastrophe of my life or the most wretched misunderstanding. I hardly know which prospect terrifies me more." Holmes settled into his chair with the air of a connoisseur preparing to savor a fine vintage. He pressed his fingertips together in that characteristic gesture I knew so well, his keen eyes fixed intently upon our visitor's troubled countenance. "Pray be assured, Mr. Willoughby, that whatever you tell us will be held in the strictest confidence. You may speak freely. I observe from the red clay still clinging to your boots that you have come directly from the Somerset levels, and that you are unaccustomed to the more sordid quarters of London. You have not, therefore, wasted time seeking other counsel." Our client started visibly. "You are perfectly right, sir. I was given your name by my cousin, Colonel Abernethy, who assured me that if any man in England could make sense of this dreadful affair, it would be you." "Colonel Abernethy speaks too kindly. Now then, the affair concerns your country residence." "It does, Mr. Holmes. I am the owner of a small estate known as Briarwell House, which has been in my family for some generations. My household at present consists of myself, my ward, Miss Alice Harrow, my widowed sister, Mrs. Lydia Marsh, and the usual complement of servants." He paused, and I noted that at the mention of his ward, his eyes flickered with what might have been concern, or perhaps something deeper. "3 nights ago," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "something occurred at Briarwell which has left us all in a state bordering upon terror. It was a calm, cloudless night, with a bright moon, much like this evening, in fact. At approximately 11:30, I was in my study, reviewing estate papers, when I heard the most dreadful cry from the direction of the south garden." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "A woman's cry?" "Yes, shrill, desperate, and then abruptly silenced. It came, I am certain, from near the old iron gate which opens upon the meadow road. That gate, Mr. Holmes, has a particular significance in our family history, though I confess the details are somewhat obscure. Pray continue with the events of that evening." "I seized a lamp and ran out immediately. In the passage, I nearly collided with my butler, Hawkins, who had also been roused by the cry. Together we hastened to the south lawn. The moon was so brilliant that we had little need of artificial light. The entire garden lay before us, clear as day, with the ancient yew trees casting long shadows across the grass." Willoughby paused to take another sip of brandy, his hand still trembling slightly. "At the far end of the lawn, where the low stone wall separates our grounds from the meadow, stands the gate I mentioned. It is an ornate piece of ironwork, dating from the last century, and it was there, beside that gate, that we found Mrs. Marsh." "In what condition?" I inquired gently. "Unconscious, doctor, lying upon the damp grass. Her evening shawl was torn, one of her shoes was missing entirely, and there was a slight bruise upon her left temple. But most disturbing of all, the gate itself was standing wide open." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "You are certain it had been secured earlier?" "As certain as I can be of anything in this world," Willoughby replied emphatically. "The south gate has been kept locked after dusk for as long as I can remember. It was a precaution instituted by my father due to poachers, and though the threat has long since passed, we have maintained the custom. I myself locked that gate at 9 o'clock that evening. I remember the hour distinctly, for I had just heard the clock in the hall chime. And the key? The key was in my waistcoat pocket when I discovered the open gate. I drew it forth in bewilderment, unable to comprehend how the gate could be standing ajar when I possessed the only means of opening it." Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Describe Mrs. Marsh's condition when she regained consciousness. That is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire affair, Mr. Holmes. When she finally opened her eyes, nearly an hour later, she was in a state of the wildest agitation. She clutched my hand with desperate strength, imploring me to have the gate secured immediately. 'He will return. Henry,' she kept repeating, 'he will surely return.' But when I pressed her to identify this mysterious he, She stared at me as if she had never seen me before, and fell to trembling so violently that the village doctor begged me to desist from questioning her. Has she spoken of the incident since? She refuses to discuss it directly, though she sometimes mutters in her sleep about promises and the moonlight. Any attempt to question her results in hysterical episodes. Mrs. Marsh is not given to feminine vapors, Mr. Holmes. She's a woman of remarkable composure and practical sense. Her current state convinces me that she witnessed something truly terrible that night. Holmes paused in his pacing to examine a photograph on the mantelpiece, though I suspected his mind was far from the image before him. You mentioned that a shoe was missing. Was it ever recovered? Never. We conducted a thorough search of the grounds the following morning, but it has vanished completely. Our gardener discovered signs of a struggle near the gate. The grass was trampled, and he insists he found the impression of a heavy boot in the soft earth, leading away from the gate toward the meadow road. But that is not all that troubles you, Holmes observed, his voice carrying a note of certainty that suggested he had already perceived more than our client had yet revealed. Willoughby hesitated, then drew from his inner pocket a telegram, already much creased from nervous handling. You are quite right, Mr. Holmes. Yesterday morning, this arrived. Holmes took the yellow paper and smoothed it upon the table. I leaned forward to read the message, which had been dispatched from the village of Briarwell itself. The moonlight reminds me of our promise at the garden gate. I'm coming to claim what is mine. The debt of 20 years must be paid. A friend from the past. A profound silence fell over our sitting room. Holmes read the message twice, his hawk-like features betraying no emotion, though I detected a subtle tension in his posture that spoke of a mind suddenly engaged with a problem of exceptional interest. For the love of heaven, Mr. Holmes, Willoughby burst out, his composure finally cracking. What can it mean? Who is this person? What promise? What debt? My sister swears she knows no one who would send such a message, yet since its arrival, she has grown increasingly distraught. She begs me to leave Briarwell, to quit England entirely if necessary. She will give no explanation, but I see terror in her eyes whenever the subject arises. Holmes moved to the window and drew aside the curtain, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street. When he turned back, his decision was already formed, and I recognized the light of the hunt in his grey eyes. Mr. Willoughby, you have presented us with a most singular combination of circumstances. An opened gate that should be locked, a lady rendered unconscious under mysterious circumstances, a missing shoe, disturbed ground, and now this cryptic message that speaks of promises and debts spanning 2 decades. It is precisely the sort of problem that appeals to my particular talents. Then you will take the case, our visitor cried, rising from his chair with evident relief. Dr. Watson and I will accompany you to Somerset by the first available train tomorrow morning. Until then, I must insist that you tell me, with complete frankness, everything you can recall of your family's history, particularly any events of 20 years ago that might relate to this friend from the past. In matters of this nature, Mr. Willoughby, the smallest omission may prove fatal to our success. As our client began his narrative of the Willoughby family history, I settled back in my chair with the familiar thrill that accompanied the opening moves of one of Holmes's investigations. The fog pressed against our windows like a living thing, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the midnight hour. The game, as my remarkable friend would say, was most decidedly afoot. The mystery of the moonlit garden gate had begun, and I sensed that before it reached its conclusion, we would uncover secrets that had lain buried for far longer than 20 years. The particulars which Mr. Henry Willoughby revealed to us during that fog-shrouded evening proved more disturbing than even his initial account had suggested. As the fire settled into glowing embers and the night deepened around our Baker Street quarters, our client's narrative took on the quality of a confession. Hesitant, painful, yet inexorably drawn forth by Holmes's penetrating questions and my friend's remarkable ability to perceive the shadows lurking behind spoken words. 20 years ago, Willoughby began, his voice barely above a whisper. My sister Lydia was not yet married. She was 23, considered one of the most accomplished young ladies in Somerset. My father had great hopes for her future. That summer, we received an unexpected visitor, a gentleman by the name of Captain Edward Carstairs, lately returned from service in Afghanistan. Holmes's eyes opened slightly, though he maintained his pose of languid attention. A military man? Indeed, he had been invalided home after suffering wounds in the Second Afghan War. A handsome fellow, possessed of considerable charm and a distinguished record of service. My father welcomed him warmly, for the Carstairs family had once been our neighbours, though their estate had fallen into financial difficulties. And your sister formed an attachment to this gentleman? I inquired gently. Willoughby's hands trembled as he set down his brandy glass. More than an attachment, Dr. Watson. They became secretly engaged. I discovered this quite by accident one evening when I observed them in earnest conversation by the south gate. Captain Carstairs was speaking of their future together, of a house he intended to purchase in India, where his regiment was to be stationed. Lydia seemed radiant with happiness. I had never seen her so animated. Yet something went wrong, Holmes observed, his tone carrying that peculiar certainty that suggested he had already divined the tragic outcome. Terribly wrong. In late August, Captain Carstairs received urgent orders to return to India immediately. The military situation had deteriorated, and experienced officers were desperately needed. He promised Lydia that he would send for her within 6 months, as soon as he could arrange suitable accommodations and secure his financial position. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out into the swirling fog. But he never sent for her. No word came for nearly a year. Lydia grew increasingly despondent, though she maintained the pretense that all was well. Then, in the spring of 1870, we received devastating news through military channels. Captain Carstairs had been killed in a skirmish near Kandahar. His personal effects, including letters he had written but never sent, were returned to England. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the distant rumble of late carriages in the street below, but within our sitting room the weight of old tragedy seemed to press upon us like a physical presence. Among those letters, Willoughby continued with visible effort, was one addressed to my father. In it, Captain Carstairs revealed that he had made certain promises to Lydia, promises that extended beyond mere matrimonial intentions. He had, it seemed, borrowed a considerable sum from my father to settle debts incurred through gambling. The loan was secured by his word as an officer and gentleman, with the understanding that it would be repaid upon his marriage to Lydia. Holmes turned sharply from the window. Your father never mentioned this debt to you? Never. I discovered the letter only after his death, hidden among his private papers. The amount was substantial, nearly £2,000. Captain Carstairs had intended to repay it from his military pension and the dowry Lydia would bring to the marriage. His death left the debt in a curious legal limbo. And the telegram speaks of a debt of 20 years, Holmes mused. Yet if Captain Carstairs died in Afghanistan, who could be making this claim now? Willoughby's face grew even paler. That is precisely what terrifies me, Mr. Holmes. According to military records, Edward Carstairs was buried in the regimental cemetery at Peshawar. Yet someone who knows intimate details of his relationship with my sister, someone who speaks of promises made at our garden gate, is very much alive and apparently in England. Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his long strides carrying him back and forth across our sitting room. You mentioned that your sister cried out the name Edward during her delirium. Has she ever spoken of believing him to be alive? Never directly, but Willoughby hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. In recent months, she has taken to walking in the south garden at night, particularly when the moon is bright. Our housekeeper has observed her standing by the gate, as if she were waiting for someone. When questioned, Lydia claims she cannot sleep and finds the night air soothing, but her manner suggests deeper currents. The clock upon our mantelpiece chimed 2 in the morning, and Holmes paused in his pacing to fix our client with a penetrating stare. "Mr. Willoughby, we shall accompany you to Somerset by the first available train, but I must warn you, the resolution of this mystery may prove more disturbing than its present uncertainty. Some debts, as your father apparently understood, are paid in currencies other than gold." As our client departed into the fog-shrouded night, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to uncover secrets that had been deliberately buried for 2 decades, and that someone was prepared to kill to ensure they remained so. The morning train from Paddington Station departed punctually at 8 o'clock, carrying us westward through the odd countryside towards Somerset. Holmes had secured a private compartment, which afforded us the opportunity to discuss the case without fear of being overheard, as the rhythmic clatter of the wheels provided a steady accompaniment to our conversation. My friend finally broke his contemplative silence with a penetrating question that revealed the direction of his thoughts. "Mr. Willoughby, you mentioned that your sister married some years after Captain Carstairs' reported death. Tell me about her husband, this Mr. Marsh, whose name she now bears." Our client shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously upon the leather armrest. Thomas Marsh was a solicitor from Bath, a thoroughly respectable gentleman of modest means. They were married in 1873, 3 years after we received news of Captain Carstairs' death. The marriage was not, I fear, a particularly happy one. "In what respect?" I inquired, noting the shadow that crossed our client's features. Marsh was considerably older than Lydia, nearly 20 years her senior. A widower with no children, he had devoted his life to his legal practice with such single-minded determination that he had little capacity for the softer emotions. My sister performed her duties as his wife with admirable diligence, but there was no warmth between them. When he died of apoplexy 5 years ago, Lydia returned to Briarwell with what I can only describe as relief. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his keen eyes fixed upon Willoughby's troubled countenance. "Did Mr. Marsh leave her comfortably provided for?" "Adequately, though not generously. His estate was smaller than one might have expected for a solicitor of his standing. There were certain investments that had gone badly, and some debts that required settlement. Lydia received enough to maintain her independence, but she chose to return to the family home rather than establish a separate household." "And your ward, Miss Alice Harrow? You have not yet spoken of her circumstances." A softer expression came over Willoughby's face at the mention of his ward. "Alice is the daughter of my late wife's sister. Both her parents perished in a railway accident when she was but 7 years old. She is now 19, a young woman of remarkable intelligence and spirit. She has been like a daughter to me these 12 years, and she has formed an unusually close bond with her Aunt Lydia." Holmes extracted his pipe and began the ritual of filling it with tobacco, though he did not light it in deference to the confined space. "Has Miss Harrow been informed of the recent disturbances?" "She knows of her aunt's collapse by the garden gate, though I have kept the telegram from her. Alice is of a nervous disposition, and I feared the cryptic message would alarm her unnecessarily. She has been most attentive to Lydia since the incident, and there are times when I observe them in quiet conversation and sense that secrets pass between them that I am not privileged to share." As our train began to slow approaching the small station at Briarwell village, Holmes rose and moved to the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the pale autumn sunlight. "One final question before we arrive. The garden gate itself. You mentioned it was of ornate ironwork dating from the last century. Is there anything distinctive about its design?" "Now that you mention it, yes. The gate bears an unusual feature, a crescent moon worked into the iron scrollwork at its center. My grandfather commissioned it from a local blacksmith who was known for incorporating celestial motifs into his work. The moon was meant to symbolize constancy and the passage of time." Holmes turned from the window, and I caught a fleeting expression of satisfaction cross his features. How very appropriate, given the circumstances. The moon has indeed proven constant in this affair, constant in its ability to illuminate secrets that prefer the darkness. We arrived at Briarwell Station under a brilliant, unclouded sky that seemed to mock the sinister purpose of our visit. A dog cart awaited us, its driver touching his cap respectfully as we approached. The journey to the house carried us through lanes bordered by high hedges, their branches still glistening with morning dew. Briarwell House itself proved to be a handsome Georgian structure of red brick, set amidst extensive grounds that rolled gently down toward the distant levels. Our arrival caused a ripple of palpable tension throughout the household. We were received at the door by Hawkins, the butler, a tall, spare individual with iron-grey hair and an air of gravity bordering on severity. His eyes, however, were shrewd and intelligent, and he regarded Holmes with the unmistakable respect of a man who recognized superior intellect. "Mrs. Marsh is resting upstairs," he informed us quietly, "but Miss Harrow asked to be informed the instant you arrived." "A moment only, Hawkins," Holmes said briskly. "Before I speak to any member of the household, I must see the garden gate and the exact spot where Mrs. Marsh was found. Time, in such matters, may efface fragile traces." We made our way across the south lawn, the grass spongy beneath our boots. The afternoon sun cast long shadows from the ancient yew trees, creating an atmosphere of brooding stillness despite the brightness of the day. As we approached the iron gate, I was immediately struck by its isolation. It stood like a sentinel at the very edge of the property, its ornate ironwork bearing the distinctive crescent moon that Willoughby had described. Holmes dropped to his knees without ceremony, producing his magnifying glass. For several minutes he examined the ground with the intensity of a bloodhound, his attention focused on the gate's mechanism. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, pointing to the hinges. "The rust is uneven here. This section has been recently disturbed. Note the faint smear of oil, where no gardener's prudence would have applied it at this season." "You mean the gate has been tampered with?" Willoughby exclaimed. "Prepared," Holmes corrected, rising and moving his attention to the ground beyond the gate. "Made ready to open silently. Only a nervous conscience oils the hinges of a gate that ought never to move." In the softer earth of the meadow road, Holmes paused and emitted a short, satisfied exclamation. "Here, Watson. Observe this depression in the grass near the gatepost. Someone rested a bicycle here recently. The tire tread is distinctive, and there appears to be evidence of a patch on the rear wheel." He moved to examine a large oak tree whose branches overhung the wall, reaching up to pluck something from a low-hanging branch. It was a scrap of fabric, dark blue wool of high quality. "A piece of a coat," I suggested, "or a military greatcoat. But observe the edge, Watson. It has not been torn. It has been cut. Someone was concealed in this tree, caught their garment, and deliberately cut themselves free rather than risk making a noise." Holmes turned to Willoughby, his expression grave. "This was no casual intruder, sir. Whoever was here came prepared, knew the grounds intimately, and was waiting for something, or someone. Your sister did not simply happen upon an open gate. She was deliberately lured here by someone who understands both the layout of your estate and the significance of that crescent moon." As we walked back toward the house, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the garden once more into shadow. The peaceful beauty of the English countryside seemed suddenly menacing, concealing secrets that daylight could not fully reveal. I glanced back at the iron gate, standing stark against the darkening sky, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The mystery was deepening with each revelation, and I sensed we had only begun to scratch the surface of a conspiracy, 20 years in the making. We had scarcely returned to the drawing room when we were greeted by a young woman whose presence immediately commanded attention. Miss Alice Harrow possessed that particular combination of intelligence and grace that marks a person of exceptional character. Her dark hair was arranged simply but elegantly, and her remarkable violet eyes held depths that spoke of both wisdom and carefully concealed anxiety. She rose as we entered, her movements betraying the tension she struggled to master. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot express my relief at your arrival," she said, her voice low but steady. "My aunt grows worse with each passing hour, and I fear that whatever torments her will soon drive her beyond the reach of reason entirely." Holmes bowed slightly, his manner courteous yet businesslike. "Miss Harrow, your concern is evident and understandable. However, before I can properly assess your aunt's condition, I must ask you several questions that may seem intrusive but are essential to my investigation." "Ask whatever you must, sir. I will conceal nothing if it might help restore my aunt's peace of mind." "Very well. Has Mrs. Marsh ever spoken to you of a Captain Edward Carstairs?" The effect of this name upon the young woman was immediate and profound. The color drained from her cheeks and she grasped the back of a chair for support. "How could you possibly know that name?" she whispered, her composure finally cracking. "Then she has mentioned him," Holmes observed, his tone gentle but persistent. "Only in her delirium, and then as if the words were torn from her very soul. 3 nights ago, after we brought her in from the garden, I sat with her through the long hours until dawn. In her fevered state, she called out to Edward repeatedly, begging his forgiveness, saying that she had waited faithfully despite everything. She spoke of promises made under moonlight and debts that could never be repaid in mere gold." Holmes began his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Harrow, I must ask you to search your memory carefully. In recent weeks, has your aunt received any correspondence that seemed to cause her particular distress?" The young woman hesitated, and I observed a struggle taking place behind those remarkable eyes. Finally, she moved to a small escritoire in the corner of the room and withdrew a key from a chain about her neck. From the locked drawer, she extracted a yellowed paper, folded and refolded many times. "I discovered this in my aunt's chamber 2 weeks ago. It had fallen behind her dressing table, and when I retrieved it, I could not help but see its contents. I know I should have returned it immediately, but the words troubled me so deeply that I kept it, hoping perhaps to understand what was causing her such evident anguish." Holmes took the paper with barely concealed eagerness. As he unfolded it, I moved to his shoulder to read the contents. The handwriting was bold and masculine, the ink faded but still legible. "My dearest Lydia, if you read this, I am dead, and these words come from beyond the grave. Know that my last thoughts were of you and the promise we made beneath the crescent moon. The debt I owe your family cannot be repaid in coin, but there is another debt, one that binds us across years and even death itself. Should I fall in battle, look for me when the moon is full and bright. I will find a way to return to you, even if I must walk through hell's gates to do so. Wait for me at our gate, my love. I swear I will come back to claim what is mine. Your devoted Edward." A profound silence settled over the drawing room. Holmes carefully refolded the letter, his expression grave. "When did you first discover this letter, Miss Harrow?" "The morning after the full moon in September. My aunt had been particularly restless that night, and I found her room in complete disarray the next day. This letter was lying on the floor as if she had been reading it and dropped it in her distress." "And 3 nights ago was the first full moon since September," Holmes observed quietly. "Precisely, Mr. Holmes, but surely you do not believe in such supernatural nonsense. A man cannot return from the dead, regardless of what promises he made in life." Before Holmes could respond, we heard footsteps in the corridor, and Mrs. Lydia Marsh herself appeared in the doorway. Despite her evident fragility, she carried herself with dignity, though her face bore the ravages of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. Her dark eyes seemed fixed on something beyond our immediate surroundings. "So you have come to investigate our family ghost," she said, her voice thin but controlled. "But you cannot arrest a memory, Mr. Holmes, nor can you reason with the dead when they come to collect what was promised them." "Perhaps not, madam," Holmes replied, stepping forward with careful courtesy. "But I can certainly apprehend a living man who uses the dead as his allies. Tell me, when you went to the garden gate 3 nights ago, what exactly did you see?" Mrs. Marsh swayed slightly, and Miss Harrow moved quickly to support her. "I saw shadows and moonlight. The gate was open. It should never be open. And there was a figure in the old uniform, just as he appeared 20 years ago." "You called out a name," Holmes pressed gently. "Was it Edward?" She gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Who told you that? Who has been listening to my private agonies?" "Your secrets have revealed themselves, Mrs. Marsh. But tell me, did you see this figure's face clearly?" She closed her eyes, a visible shudder passing through her frame. "The scarlet tunic of his regiment, with the silver braiding exactly as I remembered. He stood in the moonlight just as he had promised he would. Not a day older than when I last saw him." At that moment our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a tall, angular gentleman with impressive side whiskers and an air of official authority. Hawkins announced him as Inspector Graves of the County Constabulary, accompanied by Constable Hales. "Mr. Holmes, I have heard of your reputation," Graves said with a curt nod. "This matter at Briarwell is, of course, under my jurisdiction, but I am always willing to consider outside perspectives, provided they do not interfere with proper police procedure." "Your forbearance is appreciated, Inspector. What conclusions have you reached?" "The case is quite straightforward," Graves replied, positioning himself authoritatively before the fireplace. "We have identified the culprit as one Joel Briggs, a discharged groom with a history of petty theft and insubordination. He was dismissed from the Briarwell stables some years ago and has been observed lurking about the district. His heavy boot prints were found near the gate, and he has conveniently disappeared since the incident. The matter requires only his apprehension." Holmes regarded the inspector with interest. "A discharged employee familiar with the grounds, whose presence has been noted, and who vanishes after the crime. Indeed, Inspector, that forms a very neat theory." "You concur with my assessment, then?" "I agree that Joel Briggs is a person who merits our immediate attention," Holmes replied diplomatically. "If he is guilty, as you suggest, we shall soon establish it. If he is innocent, then he may be in considerably more danger than any of us suspected." As Inspector Graves departed, satisfied with Holmes's apparent agreement, my friend turned to me with a meaningful look. The afternoon light was fading rapidly, and through the windows I could see the iron gate standing dark against the twilight sky, its crescent moon seeming to gleam with an eerie luminescence. "Watson," Holmes murmured quietly, "observe Mrs. Marsh's hands when next you see her. There are ink stains on her fingers, a peculiar violet shade, yet she claims to have been too ill to leave her bed. Someone in this house knows far more about our ghost than they are willing to admit, and I suspect that before another moon rises, we shall discover whether the dead truly can return to claim their debts." The evening meal at Briarwell House proved a strained affair, with Mrs. Marsh remaining in her chambers and the remaining company speaking in hushed tones that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the atmosphere of unease. Miss Harrow made valiant efforts to maintain conversation, but her attempts only served to highlight the palpable tension that had settled over the household like morning fog. Holmes observed everything with his characteristic intensity, his attention particularly focused on the butler Hawkins, whose movements he followed with barely concealed interest. Following dinner, Holmes requested permission to examine Mrs. Marsh's chambers. We ascended to the first floor, where Miss Harrow led us to an elegantly appointed suite overlooking the south garden. Holmes moved through the rooms with systematic precision, his magnifying glass appearing and disappearing as he examined every surface. At the window, he paused, testing the latch and running his finger along the sill. "This window has been opened recently," he announced. "Fresh scratches on the wood, and the dust pattern is disturbed. Someone has used this route within the past few days, either entering from outside or departing in secret." Before Miss Harrow could respond to this alarming revelation, we heard a commotion from below. Inspector Graves stood triumphantly in the entrance hall, flanked by 2 constables who held between them a rough-looking individual whose clothes were torn and muddy. "Mr. Holmes, gentlemen, I present Joel Briggs," Graves announced with evident satisfaction. "Found him hiding in an abandoned cottage 3 miles hence. His resistance to arrest speaks volumes about his guilty conscience." The prisoner was a powerfully built man of perhaps 40 years, with several days' growth of beard and darting, nervous eyes. Despite his disheveled appearance, I detected something in his expression that suggested fear rather than guilt. "I ain't done nothing wrong," Briggs protested earnestly. "I swear I never touched Mrs. Marsh nor anyone else at this house." "Then why were you lurking about the property?" Graves demanded. "Because someone paid me to watch the house and report unusual happenings, particularly at night. A gentleman came to me 3 weeks ago, offered me £5 for the service." Holmes stepped forward intently. "Describe this gentleman." "Tall fellow, well-dressed, with military bearing. Spoke like an educated man, but had something foreign in his accent. Wore a long coat and kept his hat pulled low so I never saw his face proper." "And did you observe anything during your surveillance?" 2 nights before Mrs. Marsh took her fall, I saw a figure near that old gate, dressed in what looked like an officer's uniform, all red and silver in the moonlight. Stood there near an hour, watching the house, then vanished like smoke when clouds covered the moon." Holmes turned to Inspector Graves with polite firmness. "Inspector, I believe Mr. Briggs is innocent of any crime against Mrs. Marsh. However, he may assist us in identifying his mysterious employer." After the police departed, leaving Briggs in our custody, Holmes requested a private conference with Hawkins. "In the library." The butler's professional reserve seemed to crack under Holmes's penetrating gaze. "You remember Captain Carstairs well, I presume?" "Indeed, sir. A gentleman of great charm, though perhaps reckless in his habits. Popular with the staff despite his occasional financial embarrassments." "Did anyone else accompany him here? A fellow officer, perhaps?" Hawkins hesitated. "There was a sergeant major named Silas Vane. Came once or twice with the captain before they shipped to India. A rough sort, very different from the captain's usual circle. I remember him distinctly. He had a peculiar scar from jaw to ear, and he watched Miss Lydia with an insolence I found most objectionable." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden interest. "And did this Vane ever return after the war?" "Not to my knowledge, sir, though there were village rumors some years back of a stranger asking questions about the family." When we were alone, Holmes turned to me with renewed energy. "Silas Vane. A name to conjure with, Watson. A man of lower rank, privy to his officers' secrets, perhaps even his debts." Later, when Willoughby joined us for port, Holmes broached a delicate subject. "Did your father's will contain any provisions regarding Captain Carstairs' debt?" Willoughby started, his hand tightening on his glass. "There was a clause stipulating that should Carstairs or his heirs present legitimate claim for repayment, certain eastern boundary land was to be sold to satisfy it. My father considered it a matter of honor." "Is that land valuable?" "Extremely. The railway company has made several approaches about rights of way." As we prepared to retire, Holmes declined the offer of turned-down beds. "I intend to keep watch on that garden gate tonight, Watson. If our phantom soldier returns, he will find himself confronting something far more substantial than a frightened woman." The pieces of our puzzle were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly obscure. Somewhere in the darkness beyond that iron gate, I felt certain that answers awaited. Answers that might prove more disturbing than the questions themselves. The vigil we maintained that night in the grounds of Briarwell House proved to be one of the most extraordinary experiences of my long association with Sherlock Holmes. We had positioned ourselves within the dense shadows of the rhododendron bushes that bordered the south lawn, affording us an unobstructed view of the iron gate while remaining completely concealed from any observer. The moon, now in its final quarter but still brilliant, cast that peculiar silver radiance which transforms familiar landscapes into something altogether otherworldly. Holmes remained motionless beside me for hours, his breathing so controlled and his posture so still that he might have been carved from stone. The night air carried an autumn chill that seemed to penetrate to the very marrow, yet my friend showed no sign of discomfort, his entire being focused with that laser-like intensity I had witnessed countless times when he stood upon the threshold of revelation. It was approaching 2:30 when the first movement caught our attention. A figure emerged from the house, moving with careful stealth across the moonlit lawn. As it drew nearer, I recognized with considerable surprise the slender form of Miss Alice Harrow, wrapped in a dark shawl and moving with evident purpose toward the gate. She carried no light, yet navigated the familiar grounds with confidence born of long familiarity. "Most interesting," Holmes breathed into my ear, his voice barely audible. "Our young lady keeps appointments of which her guardian knows nothing." We watched as Miss Harrow approached the iron barrier, placing her hand upon the crescent moon design with what appeared to be ritualistic significance. For several minutes she remained thus, as if waiting for some predetermined signal. Then, from beyond the gate, came the soft sound of approaching footsteps on the meadow road. What appeared next defied immediate rational explanation. A figure materialized from the darkness beyond the wall, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in what appeared to be the scarlet tunic and silver braiding of a British military officer. But there was something unnaturally luminous about the apparition, a faint, phosphorescent glow that outlined its form against the night sky. Most remarkable of all, the figure seemed to pass through the iron bars of the gate as if they offered no more resistance than morning mist. Miss Harrow stepped back with a sharp intake of breath, though whether from fear or recognition I could not determine. The ghostly officer raised one gloved hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning. "You should not have come here again," Miss Harrow whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The situation has grown dangerous. Mr. Holmes suspects something, and Inspector Graves has been asking questions throughout the district." The figure's response came in a voice that was distinctly human despite its theatrical circumstances. Rough, educated, with traces of long years spent in foreign climates. "Then our time grows short, miss. Has she made her decision regarding the eastern boundary? My aunt is too ill to make any decisions. This persecution must cease, or I fear for her sanity entirely." Before the conversation could continue further, Holmes made his decision. He rose silently from our concealment, his movements fluid and purposeful. "I believe introductions are in order," he said, his voice cutting through the night air with startling clarity. "Though I suspect you are not the late Captain Edward Carstairs, despite your theatrical costume." The effect was electric. The luminous figure spun toward us, and I caught a glimpse of a weathered face marked by a distinctive scar running from jaw to ear. Miss Harrow gasped, pressing her hands to her mouth in evident distress. "There is no need for alarm," Holmes continued, stepping fully into the moonlight. "I'm Sherlock Holmes, and I believe we have much to discuss regarding debts both real and imagined, and the remarkable theatrical effects you have employed to terrorize the residents of this house." The scarred man took a step backward, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat pocket. "You understand nothing of the obligations that bind this family, Mr. Holmes. There are promises that transcend death itself." "Indeed there are," Holmes replied calmly. "But phosphorescent paint and carefully practiced sleight of hand are tools of the living, not the dead. Your luminous effects are quite ingenious, though hardly supernatural." At this revelation, our mysterious visitor seemed to realize that his charade had been penetrated. Without another word, he turned and fled through the gate, this time opening it in the conventional manner, and vanished into the mist that had begun to rise from the meadow beyond. Holmes made no immediate attempt at pursuit. Instead, he knelt beside the gate, examining the ironwork with his magnifying glass. "Observe, Watson," Traces of phosphorescent compound on the bars applied to create the illusion of passing through solid metal, and here, on the ground, footprints that tell their own story. As we prepared to return to the house, Miss Harrow approached us with evident trepidation. "Mr. Holmes, I can explain." "Explanations will be welcomed, Miss Harrow, but they must wait until morning. For now, I suggest you return to your chamber and attempt to rest. Tomorrow will bring revelations enough for all of us." We had scarcely reached the house when a new complication presented itself. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with news that chilled my blood. Mrs. Marsh's chamber was empty, her bed unslept in. Upon the pillow lay a single red rose, its petals already beginning to wilt, and the faint scent of bitter almonds hung in the air. "She has been taken," Willoughby cried in anguish when we informed him of this development. "The phantom has claimed her at last." Holmes examined the empty chamber with methodical precision. "She left of her own accord," he announced finally, though under considerable duress. "Note the absence of signs of struggle, yet the presence of this chemical residue." He scraped a small sample from the windowsill. "Someone has used pharmaceutical persuasion to ensure her compliance." As dawn began to break over the Somerset countryside, I realized that our midnight vigil had raised more questions than it had answered. The mystery of the moonlit garden gate was deepening with each revelation, and I sensed that before it reached its conclusion, we would uncover secrets that had been carefully buried for far longer than 20 years. The game, as Holmes would say, was entering its most dangerous phase. "Come, Watson," my friend said, his eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. "Our phantom may have gained a temporary advantage, but he has also revealed his hand. Before this day is done, I believe we shall know the true identity of our theatrical ghost and discover why someone is willing to commit such elaborate deceptions for a debt that should have died with Captain Edward Carstairs 20 years ago." The household at Briarwell House greeted the dawn in a state of barely controlled panic. Servants whispered in hushed clusters throughout the corridors, their faces drawn with anxiety, while Mr. Willoughby paced the drawing-room like a caged animal, alternating between desperate hope and crushing despair. Miss Harrow sat motionless in a chair by the window, her violet eyes fixed upon the iron gate that had become the focal point of so much tragedy, her pale hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles showed white against her dark mourning dress. Holmes moved through the house with that peculiar restless energy I had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelation. He examined every surface in Mrs. Marsh's abandoned chamber with methodical precision, his magnifying glass appearing and disappearing as he catalogued evidence invisible to ordinary observation. The faint chemical residue he had detected near the window, the disturbed dust patterns, the careful positioning of the wilted rose, each detail was absorbed and filed away in that remarkable mental archive he maintained. Inspector Graves arrived at precisely 8 o'clock, his expression thunderous at being summoned so early, and his manner betraying considerable skepticism about Holmes's theories of theatrical ghosts and phosphorescent paint. He entered the drawing-room with the heavy tread of official authority, his notebook already prepared to record what he clearly expected to be a straightforward case of abduction. "So we have progressed from mysterious phantoms to actual kidnapping," he announced with grim satisfaction. "This is what comes of indulging in supernatural nonsense when proper police work would have apprehended the culprit days ago." "On the contrary, Inspector," Holmes replied with perfect equanimity. "The theatrical elements were essential to understanding our adversary's true nature and objectives. Without them, we would be searching blindly for a conventional criminal when we are dealing with something far more sophisticated." Holmes turned his penetrating gaze upon Miss Harrow, his manner gentle yet inexorable. "The time for partial truths has passed, Miss Harrow. Your aunt's life may depend upon complete honesty. You recognize the man at the gate last night, the one who calls himself Silas Vane." The young woman's composure, which had held through the long night of vigil and worry, finally cracked under the weight of Holmes's steady regard. Tears welled in her remarkable eyes, though she fought them back with admirable courage. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves carried a burden too heavy to bear. "He came to me 6 weeks ago, Mr. Holmes, while I was returning from the village school where I assist with the children's lessons. A tall man with military bearing and that terrible scar from jaw to ear. He introduced himself as Sergeant Major Silas Vane, formerly of Captain Carstairs' regiment." "And you believed his credentials?" Inspector Graves interjected with professional suspicion. "He possessed such intimate knowledge of my aunt's past, Inspector, details that only someone very close to Captain Carstairs could have known. He spoke of private conversations between my aunt and the captain, of secret meetings by the garden gate, of promises made under moonlight that no outsider could have witnessed." Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "What did he claim to want?" Miss Harrow drew a shuddering breath before continuing. "He said that Captain Carstairs had not died at Kandahar as we believed, but had been taken prisoner by Afghan tribesmen. According to Vane's story, the captain had escaped years later and lived in hiding throughout India, accumulating debts and struggling to survive under assumed names. Vane claimed that before Carstairs finally succumbed to his wounds only 3 years ago, he said, he had charged his faithful sergeant with a sacred mission: to collect the debt owed by your family," Holmes observed quietly. "Not merely the £2,000 borrowed from my uncle, but also what he called the dowry debt, the marriage portion that would have come with my aunt's hand, which Carstairs claimed had been promised to secure his financial obligations. Vane demanded that we transfer the eastern boundary lands to satisfy these combined debts, threatening that if we refused, he would make public certain compromising letters that Carstairs had preserved." Willoughby, who had been listening with mounting horror, burst out, "Letters? What letters could possibly justify such extortion?" Miss Harrow's face flushed crimson with shame and embarrassment. "Written in the passion of youth, Uncle Henry. Expressions of affection and commitment that no respectable widow could afford to have exposed to public scrutiny. Vane showed me copies, written in what appeared to be my aunt's own hand, containing sentiments that would destroy her reputation and position in society if revealed." "Blackmail," Inspector Graves pronounced with satisfaction. "A straightforward criminal matter, whatever theatrical embellishments this Vane may have employed." Holmes had begun his characteristic pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his keen mind clearly working through the implications of Miss Harrow's revelation. The phosphorescent effects, the carefully timed appearances during the full moon, the military costume, all calculated to exploit Mrs. Marsh's guilt and superstition while providing Vane with psychological leverage for his blackmail scheme. "But why did you not come to me with this intelligence?" Willoughby demanded, his voice thick with hurt and bewilderment. "Because Aunt Lydia begged me to handle the matter quietly," Miss Harrow replied miserably. "She feared the shock would be too much for your constitution, and she believed that given time, she could reason with Vane or find some way to satisfy his demands without involving you. Instead, his performances at the gate grew more aggressive and his threats more explicit." Holmes paused in his pacing to fix our client with a sharp look. "Mr. Willoughby, the eastern boundary lands that Vane has demanded, have they been the subject of any recent interest from outside parties?" "Why, yes, now that you mention it. A geological survey team requested permission to examine the soil composition there some months ago in connection with potential railway development. Their report indicated nothing of particular value, though they were quite thorough in their examination." "I suspect," Holmes murmured, his eyes taking on that distant quality that indicated rapid mental calculation, "that their report to you was deliberately unremarkable, while their private findings were quite the opposite. The eastern boundary may conceal mineral deposits or other valuable resources that would make those acres worth far more than their agricultural value." Holmes moved to the window and gazed out across the grounds toward the iron gate that had become the symbol of so much mystery and pain. "But Vane has made a crucial error in taking Mrs. Marsh. He has transformed a campaign of psychological manipulation into a criminal act that cannot be concealed or explained away. The question now is where he has taken her. I shall organize a systematic search of every abandoned building within 10 miles, Inspector Graves declared with official determination. That will not be necessary, Inspector. Our man is a soldier. He thinks strategically about defensive positions and lines of retreat. He will have chosen a location that provides both concealment and symbolic significance. Holmes turned to Willoughby with sudden intensity. The old gamekeeper's cottage on the eastern boundary. It has stood empty for years, has it not? Willoughby's eyes widened with comprehension. Since my father dismissed the last keeper nearly a decade ago, the building is isolated, surrounded by dense woodland, and few people even remember its existence. Then that is where we shall find Mrs. Marsh, Holmes declared with conviction. Watson, fetch your service revolver. Inspector, I suggest you bring armed constables. Silas Vane is a desperate man with military training, and cornered soldiers can be exceedingly dangerous. As our party prepared to depart, Holmes, myself, Inspector Graves, 2 sturdy constables, and Willoughby, who refused to be left behind despite Holmes's counsel, my friend drew me aside for a quiet word. This affair has layers within layers, Watson. Vane is certainly a blackmailer and kidnapper, but I suspect he is also a tool, perhaps an unwitting one, being manipulated by someone with far greater intelligence and more sinister purpose. The geological survey, the precise timing of his approach, the sophisticated understanding of human psychology, these suggest a mind that operates on a level far above that of a discharged sergeant major. You believe someone else is directing these events? I'm convinced of it. Before this day ends, I believe we shall discover that the true architect of this conspiracy is someone far closer to Briarwell House than any of us have yet suspected. The morning mist still clung to the hollows and dells as we made our way across the eastern boundary, following an overgrown path that wound through increasingly dense woodland. The gamekeeper's cottage appeared before us like something from a Gothic tale, a squat stone structure with a sagging roof and windows that stared out from the undergrowth like dark, accusing eyes. Smoke rose from the chimney, confirming that the building was occupied. Holmes raised his hand for silence, and we advanced with weapons drawn toward whatever revelation awaited us within those crumbling walls. The game was entering its most dangerous phase, and I could not shake the feeling that before it reached its conclusion, we would uncover secrets that had been buried far deeper and for far longer than 20 years. The mystery of the moonlit garden gate was approaching its climax, but I sensed that the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove more disturbing than any of us had yet imagined. The gamekeeper's cottage. The approach to the abandoned gamekeeper's cottage required the utmost caution, for we were dealing with a man of military training who had already demonstrated both cunning and desperation. Holmes positioned our party with tactical precision. Inspector Graves and his constables circling to secure the rear exit, while Willoughby and I accompanied my friend toward the front entrance. The morning sun had burned away the mist, yet the dense canopy of ancient oaks maintained an atmosphere of perpetual twilight around the crumbling stone structure. Through the grimy windows, we could detect movement within, and the thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney confirmed that our quarry was indeed in residence. Holmes paused some 20 yards from the door, his keen eyes noting every detail of the cottage's condition and surroundings. The building showed signs of recent habitation, cleared pathways, repaired shutters, and a general tidiness that spoke of careful preparation. Either remarkable carelessness in leaving, the door ajar, Holmes murmured, or a deliberate invitation. Watson, keep your revolver ready but concealed. I suspect we are expected, though perhaps not in the manner our host anticipates. With a sudden, decisive movement, Holmes pushed open the cottage door and strode inside, his commanding presence filling the low-ceilinged room. What we discovered defied our most pessimistic expectations. The interior had been transformed from abandoned ruin into something approaching comfortable quarters. A cheerful fire burned in the grate, casting warm light across recently cleaned walls, and the furnishings, though simple, were arranged with military precision. Mrs. Lydia Marsh sat in a cushioned chair near the hearth, a blanket across her knees and her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that steamed gently in the morning air. She appeared unharmed, though profoundly weary, her face bearing the marks of recent emotional strain. Standing beside her was the scarred figure we knew as Silas Vane, no longer dressed in his theatrical military costume, but wearing the rough clothes of a country laborer. Most remarkable of all, however, was the third occupant of the cottage, a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, distinguished in bearing despite the obvious marks of hardship and tropical disease. His iron-grey hair was neatly combed, his posture erect with military bearing, and his weathered features bore such striking resemblance to the portrait of Captain Carstairs that hung in Briarwell House that recognition was instantaneous, despite the passage of 20 years. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," the gentleman said with remarkable composure, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "I am Edward Carstairs. Major Carstairs now, though that rank was earned under another name in another life. I believe we have considerable matters to discuss." The silence that followed this extraordinary announcement seemed to stretch into eternity. Willoughby stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and profound confusion. Mrs. Marsh turned her gaze toward us, and I saw in her expression not fear, but something approaching relief, as if a burden carried for 2 decades had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Holmes recovered his composure with characteristic swiftness, though I detected the gleam of intense interest in his grey eyes. "Your resurrection is most convenient, Major Carstairs, though I suspect the reports of your death at Kandahar were not entirely accidental. Sergeant Vane, you may step away from Mrs. Marsh. I assure you that concealment serves no purpose at this juncture." Carstairs gestured toward the remaining chairs with the manner of a host receiving expected guests. "Please, gentlemen, be seated. Mrs. Marsh has endured considerable strain, and your arrival permits me to explain circumstances that have remained hidden far too long. Inspector Graves, your constables may stand down. There will be no violence here." As we arranged ourselves in the cottage's modest furnishings, I observed the interplay of emotions among our little group. Mrs. Marsh watched Carstairs with an expression that mingled old affection with present uncertainty. Vane stood apart, his scarred face bearing the look of a man who had played his part and awaited judgment. Holmes settled into his chair with that peculiar alertness that indicated a mind working at maximum capacity. The reports of my death in 1870 were, as Mr. Holmes has surmised, deliberately fabricated, Carstairs began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed this explanation many times in his own mind. "I was indeed wounded at Kandahar, grievously so, and taken prisoner by Afghan tribesmen. During my captivity, which lasted nearly 4 years, I had considerable time to reflect upon my circumstances and the debts I had accumulated through my own foolishness and poor judgment. The £2,000 borrowed from Mr. Willoughby's father," Holmes observed quietly. "Among other obligations, yes. When I finally escaped and made my way back to British-controlled territory, I discovered that I had been officially declared dead. My personal effects returned to England, and my former life effectively concluded. I was faced with a choice: return to England as a financial embarrassment and social pariah, or remain dead and attempt to build a new life under an assumed identity." Mrs. Marsh spoke for the first time since our arrival, her voice stronger than I had yet heard it. "He wrote to me, Mr. Holmes, 5 years after his supposed death. A letter that reached me through circuitous channels, explaining his survival and his decision to remain abroad. He released me from all promises, urged me to marry and find happiness, and asked only that I remember him kindly." "Yet you preserved his memory faithfully," Holmes observed with gentle understanding. "How could I do otherwise? The man I loved had sacrificed his honor and his very identity rather than return and face disgrace." I married Thomas Marsh out of duty and social necessity, not love. When he died, I felt only guilt that I could not mourn him as a proper widow should." Carstairs leaned forward, his expression earnest and marked by evident regret. "I remained in India for nearly 20 years, Mr. Holmes, rebuilding my life under the name of Edward Marsh. A small irony, considering Lydia's married name. I prospered eventually, through legitimate business ventures in tea and railway construction, and accumulated sufficient wealth to repay my debts many times over. But I could never return to England while those who knew me still lived, and while the scandal of my financial failures might still damage innocent parties. Until recently," Holmes interjected with characteristic perception, "something changed your circumstances. My health began to fail. The wounds I sustained in Afghanistan, combined with tropical diseases and the accumulated strain of years in harsh climates, convinced my physicians that I had perhaps 18 months remaining. I determined that before I died, I would settle my accounts honorably and see Lydia one final time, not to renew old promises, but to ask her forgiveness and ensure that the Willoughby family received proper compensation for their losses." Willoughby, who had been listening with mounting bewilderment, finally found his voice. "But the theatrical performances, the phosphorescent effects, the terrorizing of my household, how does any of this constitute honorable behavior?" Vane stepped forward, his scarred face flushing with evident shame. "That was my doing, sir, and I take full responsibility. The Major wanted only to approach Mrs. Marsh quietly and arrange repayment of the debt. I convinced him that a more dramatic approach would be necessary to overcome her initial shock and disbelief at seeing a man she believed dead." "You exceeded your authority considerably, Sergeant," Carstairs said with quiet reproach. "Your methods caused precisely the distress I had hoped to avoid." Holmes rose and moved to examine a collection of documents laid out on a small table near the window. "These are the deeds to the eastern boundary lands, I presume. And this," he lifted a leather portfolio with evident interest, "contains geological surveys indicating substantial mineral deposits beneath the surface. The railway company's interest was not merely in rights of way, but in extraction rights for coal and possibly iron ore." "Precisely, Mr. Holmes. I learned of the deposits through business contacts in London who had conducted private surveys. The value of those lands is approximately £15,000, 7 times the original debt. I intended to purchase them at full market value, ensuring that the Willoughby family profited substantially while allowing me to discharge my obligation with compound interest." "A noble sentiment," Holmes observed, though his tone carried subtle reservations, yet somewhat undermined by Sergeant Vane's campaign of psychological terrorism. "Mrs. Marsh, you recognized your former suitor during his theatrical appearance at the gate?" She nodded slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she set down her teacup. "Not at first. The costume and the phosphorescent effects confused my senses, and 20 years had changed him considerably. But when he spoke, even attempting to disguise his voice, I knew. Time cannot erase the sound of a voice once deeply loved." "And yet you fled from him in terror," Inspector Graves interjected with official skepticism. "Because I thought I was losing my sanity," Mrs. Marsh replied with painful honesty. "To see a dead man walking in the moonlight, speaking of promises and debts, what rational person would not flee from such an apparition? It was only later, when Sergeant Vane approached me directly and showed me Edward's personal effects, that I began to understand the truth." Holmes turned to Vane with penetrating intensity. "These personal effects, Captain Carstairs' diary, I presume? That would explain your intimate knowledge of private conversations and personal details that no outsider could have possessed." Vane reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age and tropical humidity. "The captain gave this to me before what we thought would be his final battle, sir. Said if anything happened to him, I should take it to his family as proof of his last thoughts. When I learned he had survived but chosen to remain dead, I kept it as insurance." "Insurance against what?" Holmes demanded. "Against poverty, sir. against spending my final years in a workhouse or begging on street corners. I had served faithfully for 25 years, been wounded in 3 campaigns, and received a pension that wouldn't keep a dog alive. When the Major found me in London and explained his plan to return, I saw an opportunity to secure my own future as well. Carstairs' expression grew stern with disapproval. I offered you honest employment and a generous pension, Vane. There was no need for theatrical deceptions or psychological manipulation. Begging your pardon, sir, but you were always too much of a gentleman to understand how the world treats old soldiers. I thought a bit of drama would make the lady more cooperative about the land transaction. Holmes moved to the window and gazed out across the woodland toward the distant spire of Briarwell village church. A plausible explanation for most of our mystery, gentlemen, yet several elements remain troubling. The geological surveys were conducted months before Major Carstairs contacted you, Sergeant Vane. Someone else knew the value of that land and may have been manipulating events from the beginning. The cottage fell silent save for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind in the autumn leaves. Holmes turned back to our assembled company, his expression grave with unspoken suspicions. I believe, Inspector Graves, that while Sergeant Vane's methods were reprehensible, the resolution of this immediate matter might best be served by allowing Major Carstairs to complete his business transaction and depart England without further complications. However, I strongly suspect that we have been observing only the surface of a more complex conspiracy, one that may yet require our continued attention. As we prepared to escort Mrs. Marsh back to Briarwell House, leaving Carstairs to conclude his affairs under police supervision, Holmes drew me aside with a troubled expression. The pieces fit together too neatly, Watson. Before we consider this case closed, I intend to examine certain financial records and recent correspondence that may reveal whether Major Carstairs' resurrection serves purposes beyond romantic redemption and honorable debt repayment. Someone orchestrated those geological surveys, and someone has been very carefully positioning themselves to benefit from the outcome of this entire affair. The morning sun had risen fully now, burning away the shadows that had cloaked the gamekeeper's cottage in mystery. Yet despite the brightness of the day and the apparent resolution of our immediate concerns, I could not dispel the unease that Holmes's words had awakened. The mystery of the moonlit garden gate seemed to be approaching its conclusion, but my friend's instincts, those remarkable intuitive powers that had served us so well in countless previous cases, suggested that the final revelation still awaited us within the familiar walls of Briarwell House itself. The return journey to Briarwell House was accomplished in contemplative silence, with Mrs. Marsh appearing more at peace than she had in weeks, though Holmes maintained that peculiar restlessness which I had learned to recognize as the prelude to further revelation. Upon our arrival, we found the household in a state of subdued relief, yet my friend's manner suggested that our investigation was far from complete. He immediately requested access to the estate's correspondence files, his keen eyes searching for details that others might have overlooked. "The geological survey remains the key, Watson," Holmes murmured as we settled in the library. "Someone initiated that survey months before Carstairs contacted Vane, someone who possessed intimate knowledge of the estate and access to its business correspondence. The timing is too precise to be coincidental." For nearly 2 hours, Holmes immersed himself in papers with methodical intensity, cross-referencing dates and signatures with his magnifying glass. Suddenly, he emitted a sharp exclamation of triumph, holding up 2 documents for my inspection. "Observe these signatures, Watson. Both purport to be Henry Willoughby's hand, yet note the subtle differences. The hesitation in the pen strokes, the slightly altered pressure. Someone has been conducting business in Mr. Willoughby's name without his knowledge." At that moment, Hawkins entered with afternoon tea, his usual composure intact, though I detected a barely perceptible tremor in his hands as he approached the desk laden with incriminating documents. "Thank you, Hawkins," Holmes said pleasantly, not looking up. 30 years of faithful service must have afforded you considerable insight into the family's private affairs, their financial difficulties, their correspondence, their most carefully guarded secrets. The butler stiffened visibly, his professional mask beginning to slip. I've always maintained the strictest discretion, sir. Indeed you have. So discreet, in fact, that when you intercepted the geological survey results confirming substantial coal deposits beneath the eastern boundary, you saw an opportunity that your modest savings and recent investment losses made irresistible. Hawkins's face drained of color, leaving him looking suddenly aged and vulnerable. I don't understand what you're suggesting, sir. Holmes rose from his chair, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. You forged your master's signature to authorize the survey, intercepted the report confirming the mineral wealth, and then, by extraordinary fortune, learned through servants' gossip that Major Carstairs lived and planned to return. You contacted Sergeant Vane, provided him with intimate family details, supplied the phosphorescent paint and theatrical props from the house's own stores. You orchestrated this entire haunting to manipulate the land transaction for your own benefit. The old servant's composure crumbled entirely. He grasped the desk for support, his voice barely audible. I never meant harm to come to anyone. 30 years I've served this family, watching them prosper while I saved every penny. My investments failed, sir. I faced destitution in my old age. When I discovered the coal deposits, I thought if I could manage the sale properly, take a small commission. You saw Major Carstairs' return as the perfect cover. Holmes continued relentlessly. The debt provided legal justification for the land transfer, while his planned immediate sale would allow you to act as intermediary, skimming substantial profits, or perhaps blackmailing him regarding his false identity. Henry Willoughby appeared in the doorway, summoned by Holmes's earlier message. He stopped short at the sight of his trusted servant weeping in the chair, his expression cycling through shock, disappointment, and profound sadness. 30 years, Hawkins, Willoughby said quietly. If you were in difficulties, why did you not come to me directly? Pride, sir, the butler whispered, and shame. A man doesn't wish to admit he's been a fool with his life savings. Holmes moved to the window overlooking the garden where the iron gate stood silhouetted against the evening sky. The case is closed, Watson. The theatrical ghost has been unmasked, the financial conspiracy exposed, and the human motivations laid bare. What remains is for this family to decide how justice and mercy might be balanced. Later, as we prepared to depart Briarwell House, Mrs. Marsh approached us with quiet dignity. Mr. Holmes, Major Carstairs has agreed to purchase the eastern boundary at fair market value, £15,000. The family's financial security is assured, and I have finally made peace with choices made long ago. Some chapters of life are best left closed, their lessons learned rather than their stories repeated. Miss Harrow stood beside her aunt, their bond strengthened by shared trials. The haunting is ended, Mr. Holmes. The gate stands open now, leading not to the past, but to whatever future we choose to create. As our carriage departed through that very gate, Holmes reflected philosophically on the case's resolution. A complex web of human motivations. Watson, love and deception, loyalty and betrayal, desperation and redemption. Hawkins's actions were reprehensible, yet his desperation was understandable. Major Carstairs sought to discharge an honorable debt while being manipulated by those who exploited his integrity. Mrs. Marsh chose wisdom over romance, and the Willoughby family emerges stronger despite the trials they have endured. The crescent moon worked into the iron gate caught the last light of day as we passed beneath it, no longer a symbol of mystery and haunting, but simply an elegant piece of craftsmanship marking the boundary between one chapter of life and the next. The mystery of the moonlit garden gate had been solved through methodical investigation rather than supernatural intervention, proving once again that human nature, in all its complexity, provides sufficient mystery for any detective willing to observe, deduce, and understand the intricate motivations that drive us all. Our return to Baker Street occurred under the pale light of an October afternoon, the familiar rhythms of London life providing a comforting counterpoint to the rural mysteries we had left behind in Somerset. Holmes maintained his characteristic silence during the journey, his keen eyes fixed upon the passing countryside, though I suspected his mind was already cataloguing the case's unique features for future reference. The fog that had shrouded our departure 3 days earlier had cleared, replaced by crisp autumn air that seemed to mirror the resolution we had achieved at Briarwell House. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with evident relief, having prepared a substantial tea against our return. Within the hour, we were restored to our accustomed surroundings, Holmes settling into his chair by the fire, while I arranged my notes for the narrative that would become this very chronicle. The chemical apparatus, the Persian slipper filled with tobacco, the correspondence transfixed to the mantelpiece with a jackknife, all seemed particularly welcoming after the disturbing events we had witnessed. The resolution of the Briarwell affair had required delicate negotiation over several days. Mr. Willoughby, demonstrating the mercy that marks true gentlemen, had chosen to pension Hawkins quietly, rather than pursue criminal charges that would have resulted in imprisonment. The elderly butler would retire to a modest cottage, his 30 years of faithful service weighing heavily against his final weeks of desperate folly. A humane decision, Holmes had observed approvingly. Justice need not always be accompanied by vengeance, particularly when the offender demonstrates genuine remorse. Major Carstairs had completed his business with dignified efficiency, purchasing the eastern boundary lands for £15,000, a sum that transformed the Willoughby family's prospects while allowing him to discharge his debt with substantial interest. His health visibly deteriorating, he had departed immediately for India, where he intended to spend his remaining months in the climate that had become his true home. Most poignant had been our final interview with Mrs. Marsh, who had approached Holmes with quiet dignity on our last evening at Briarwell. From her pocket, she had withdrawn a small velvet box containing an exquisite silver locket worked in the shape of a crescent moon, a wedding gift commissioned 20 years earlier but never presented. Edward kept this through all his trials, she had explained with touching simplicity. Now he insists I should have it, not as a promise of what might have been, but as acknowledgement of what genuinely existed between us. Holmes had examined the locket with professional interest, noting the delicate craftsmanship and engraved initials. A fitting memorial to a chapter of your life that has finally reached its proper conclusion. Now settled once more in our Baker Street refuge, Holmes moved to his filing cabinet and extracted a fresh index card. "The case of the Moonlit garden gate," he murmured, making notes in his precise hand. Cross-referenced under phosphorescence, impersonation, and geological frauds. It demonstrates perfectly how each principal actor stood at a gate of some kind, emotional, financial, or moral, and hesitated before passing through. "You observed remarkable patterns in human behavior," I remarked, reviewing my own notes. "Consider it, Watson." Mrs. Marsh stood at the threshold between past and present, torn between memory and reality. Major Carstairs at the entrance between dishonor and belated reparation. Hawkins at the gateway to poverty, tempted by the illusion of a single bold stroke. Even Inspector Graves hovered between routine police work and genuine understanding, though he never quite crossed over. Holmes reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings to produce a melancholic air that seemed to capture the essence of the Somerset autumn. The supernatural is invariably the refuge of the scoundrel or the desperate. Watson. Remove the theatrical trappings, the phosphorescent paint, the ghostly uniforms, the moonlight vigils, and what remains? Human avarice, financial desperation, and the enduring power of past affections. And the lesson for our readers. Holmes paused in his playing, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. that we are all haunted by choices made and opportunities lost, yet we retain the capacity to choose how those memories shape our present actions. The past never truly releases its hold upon us, but neither must it determine our future. As the London evening deepened around our comfortable quarters, Holmes set aside his violin and moved toward his chemical apparatus, already absorbed in some new problem. I observed from the pile of correspondence on the mantelpiece that the metropolis had not been idle during our absence. Letters bearing foreign postmarks and official seals promised fresh mysteries requiring his unique talents. "Another case concluded, Watson," he remarked without looking up from his test tubes, "though I suspect the human dramas we witnessed at Briarwell will continue to unfold long after our involvement has ended." The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows across our familiar sitting room, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the evening hour. The mystery of the moonlit garden gate had been solved through methodical investigation rather than supernatural intervention, proving once again that human nature provides sufficient complexity for any detective willing to observe, deduce, and understand the intricate motivations that bind us all together in such curious and often tragic patterns. The game, as Holmes would say, continued. The weeks following our return from Somerset brought with them the familiar rhythms of London life. Yet the Briarwell affair lingered in our thoughts with unusual persistence. Holmes had resumed his chemical experiments with characteristic intensity, while I found myself frequently gazing out our Baker Street windows toward the fog-shrouded streets, my mind returning to that moonlit garden gate and the complex web of human motivations we had unraveled there. It was during the third week of November that the first news reached us from Somerset. A letter arrived bearing Miss Alice Harrow's elegant script, bringing intelligence that proved both gratifying and poignant. Major Carstairs had passed away peacefully in Bombay, his final weeks made comfortable by the knowledge that his long-standing debt had been honorably discharged. His will, executed by competent solicitors, had confirmed all arrangements regarding the eastern boundary lands, ensuring the Willoughby family's financial security for generations to come. A gentleman's conclusion to a gentleman's obligation, Holmes observed upon reading the correspondence. However misguided his theatrical methods, Carstairs understood that true reparation lies not in mere monetary payment, but in securing the future welfare of those one has wronged. The letter contained additional intelligence that warmed my heart considerably. Miss Harrow wrote with evident happiness of her engagement to a young architect employed by the railway company, a man whose profession would benefit directly from the mineral wealth now being extracted from the former Willoughby lands. The symmetry pleased Holmes enormously. Observe the elegant resolution, Watson. The railway that revealed the land's value now provides employment for the family's newest member. Life arranges itself with an artistry that rivals the most sophisticated criminal plot. Mrs. Marsh, we learned, had found unexpected solace in artistic pursuits. She spent her days painting landscapes of the estate grounds with particular attention to the iron gate that had been the focal point of so much drama. Miss Harrow noted that her aunt seemed to have achieved genuine peace, no longer haunted by memories of choices made in youth, but rather inspired by the beauty of her present surroundings. Holmes set down the letter and moved to his violin, drawing from it a melody that seemed to capture both melancholy and acceptance. She has transformed the gate from a symbol of imprisonment into one of artistic inspiration. The human capacity for emotional alchemy never ceases to amaze me. A subsequent communication from Inspector Graves informed us that his handling of the Briarwell case had attracted favorable notice from his superiors at Scotland Yard. His promotion to Chief Inspector had been confirmed, along with a commendation for his thorough and methodical approach to complex criminal matters. Holmes received this news with dry amusement. "Our excellent Graves rises another rung upon the official ladder," he observed. "The world is so arranged that authority receives advancement for results it only dimly comprehends. Yet I bear him no ill will. Better that the yard prosper through partial understanding than founder in complete ignorance. One evening, as the November fog pressed against our windows with particular density, I broached a question that had long occupied my thoughts. Holmes, in all our investigations, have you ever encountered a case where the resolution left you with such mixed feelings about justice and mercy? He set aside his chemical apparatus and settled into his chair, his keen eyes reflecting the firelight. The Briarwell affair was unusual, Watson, in that nearly every participant stood at some threshold of moral choice. Mrs. Marsh between past and present, Major Carstairs between dishonor and belated redemption, Hawkins between poverty and temptation, even young Miss Harrow between family loyalty and personal integrity. And yet the resolution benefited nearly everyone involved. Precisely why it haunts us both. We are accustomed to cases where justice demands punishment, where the guilty must face consequences for their actions. At Briarwell, we found instead a situation where mercy served justice better than retribution ever could have. Hawkins received his pension rather than prison, Carstairs discharged his debt with dignity, and the Willoughby family prospered beyond their wildest expectations. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out into the fog-shrouded street. The gate itself became the perfect symbol for the entire affair. An ornate barrier marked with a crescent moon designed to represent constancy. Yet every major event associated with it involved change, revelation, or transformation. The symbol remained constant while the human reality shifted continuously around it. Do you believe we shall hear from Briarwell again? Unlikely. The pressures have been released, the secrets exposed, and the financial motivations resolved. Criminality requires tension, Watson, unresolved conflict, desperate need, or suppressed passion. Briarwell House has been purged of these elements and will likely sink back into the comfortable obscurity of English country life. As if summoned by our conversation, Mrs. Hudson appeared with the Evening Post, among which was a small package bearing foreign stamps. Holmes opened it to reveal a photograph of the iron gate, painted in watercolors with remarkable skill. Mrs. Marsh had captured not merely the physical structure, but somehow conveyed the emotional weight it had carried. The moonlight seemed to dance across the iron crescents, and the gate appeared less like a barrier than a doorway to possibilities. Enclosed with the painting was a brief note in Mrs. Marsh's careful hand. For Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, who helped us all pass through our various gates into whatever peace we could find on the other side. The moon still shines, but it no longer haunts. With deepest gratitude, L.M. Holmes examined the painting with evident appreciation. She has understood something that escapes most people, Watson. The past need not be a prison if we can transform our relationship to it. This gate is no longer a symbol of lost love or unfulfilled promises, but of artistic inspiration and emotional growth. The fire burned low in the grate, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the midnight hour. The mystery of the moonlit garden gate had taught us that the greatest puzzles sometimes concern not crimes committed, but promises kept, and that the human capacity for redemption can create transformations more remarkable than any supernatural phenomenon. "Come, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, setting aside the watercolor. "I hear the fog is beginning to lift, and I have a fancy for a walk through the quieter streets. Tomorrow will bring new mysteries, new gates to open or close, new human dramas requiring our attention. But tonight, let us simply appreciate the satisfaction of a case concluded with honor, intact, and hearts healed." As we ventured out into the London night, I reflected on how our profession allowed us to step briefly but intensely into the lives of strangers, serving as catalysts in their personal chemistry before withdrawing once more into the anonymity of the great city. We were problem solvers and truth seekers, but perhaps most importantly, we were witnesses to the endless capacity of the human spirit to find light even in the darkest circumstances. The case of the Moonlit Garden Gate had ended not with arrests or prosecutions, but with reconciliation and renewal. It stood as testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest detective work lies not in exposing deception, but in recognizing when truth, mercy, and justice can be served simultaneously. The game, as Holmes would say, continued, but with the knowledge that even the most complex mysteries ultimately resolve into the fundamental human story of our endless search for understanding, forgiveness, and peace. The winter of 1889 settled upon London with particular severity, transforming Baker Street into a corridor of frosted windows and glowing hearths. Our sitting room had acquired a festive warmth despite Holmes's general indifference to seasonal celebrations, and it was there, on a particularly bitter December evening, that the final chapter of the Briarwell affair revealed itself through an unexpected communication from Somerset. The envelope bore the familiar Willoughby crest, but its contents proved more remarkable than any routine correspondence. Within lay an invitation to Miss Alice Harrow's spring wedding to the young railway architect, accompanied by news that brought both satisfaction and gentle melancholy. Henry Willoughby wrote with evident joy of his family's continued prosperity, the coal deposits yielding exceptional returns, his sister's artistic career flourishing beyond all expectation, and the household restored to harmony. Most intriguing, however, was the enclosed legal document from Major Carstairs' London solicitors, a final codicil to his will, discovered only after the settlement of his Indian estate, bequeathed £500 in perpetual trust for the maintenance of the iron gate at Briarwell, with the specific stipulation that it must never again be locked. Debts of honor, the Major had written, require open pathways, not barriers. Holmes examined the document with evident appreciation. A final gesture of considerable elegance, Watson. Even from beyond the grave, our theatrical Major continues to influence the landscape of the living. The symbol of his exclusion becomes the symbol of openness for all who follow. The letter continued with intelligence that warmed my heart considerably. Mrs. Marsh's watercolors of the gate had attracted attention from London galleries, her artistic interpretation transforming what had been a source of torment into a wellspring of creative inspiration. The iron crescent moon that had once seemed to mock her loneliness now graced canvases that spoke of hope, transformation, and the eternal human capacity for renewal. "She has achieved something remarkable," Holmes observed, gazing at her painting which had found permanent residence upon our mantelpiece. The alchemical transformation of haunting into art, of painful memory into universal truth. Her gate no longer imprisons the past, but opens doorways to the future. As evening deepened and the fire settled into glowing embers, I ventured to ask Holmes whether the emotional complexities of the Briarwell case had influenced his approach to subsequent investigations. "On the contrary, Watson, they clarified it," he replied, reaching for his violin. "We spend our professional lives investigating the aberrations of human nature. Crime, deceit, violence. Briarwell reminded me that the greatest mysteries often concern not criminal behavior, but the intricate navigation of moral landscapes. There was no true villainy there, only desperate people seeking to honor their obligations and secure their futures." The melody he drew from the strings seemed to capture the entire Somerset experience. Melancholy yet hopeful, complex yet ultimately harmonious. "The supernatural," he continued, "invariably proves to be the refuge of the desperate or the theatrical. Remove the phosphorescent paint and ghostly uniforms, and what remains? Human beings struggling with love, loyalty, regret, and the eternal desire for redemption." A knock at our door interrupted this philosophical discourse, and Mrs. Hudson announced the arrival of Willoughby himself, who had come to London for Christmas shopping. He appeared transformed, years younger, his manner confident and unburdened. "The eastern boundary development proceeded magnificently," he reported, "bringing prosperity to the entire district." And the gate, Mr. Holmes, stands open day and night, exactly as the Major's will specified. The villagers have taken to calling it the Lover's Gate. Young couples meet there regularly, finding romance where once there was only haunting. Rather poetic justice, wouldn't you agree? Holmes smiled with genuine warmth. The human capacity for rewriting history through present action never ceases to amaze me. The sight of past heartbreak becomes the setting for future happiness. After Willoughby's departure, Holmes returned to his violin, playing softly as London's winter evening deepened around us. We are all haunted by gates of one kind or another, Watson, barriers of pride, fear, or regret that we construct around our hearts. Our work, at its finest, involves not merely catching criminals, but finding the keys to those gates, or proving they need not be locked at all. The church bells of London began their evening chorus, their harmonious pealing drifting through the frost-laden air. Holmes set aside his instrument and moved toward his chemical apparatus, already absorbed in some new problem. Yet his glance lingered momentarily on Mrs. Marsh's watercolor, acknowledging the rare symmetry of a case where justice and mercy had walked hand in hand through the moonlight. The mystery of the moonlit garden gate was truly concluded. Not with dramatic arrests or courtroom revelations, but with the quiet restoration of peace to troubled hearts and the transformation of haunting symbols into sources of inspiration. It stood as testament that sometimes the most valuable detective work involves not exposing deception, but facilitating truth, reconciliation, and the opening of pathways from past pain to future possibility. The fire burned low in the grate, and somewhere in the distance, a new case awaited. But for this moment, we were content knowing that in one corner of Somerset, an iron gate stood open beneath the winter stars, no longer a barrier, but a doorway, welcoming all who sought to pass from the shadows of yesterday into the promise of tomorrow.